This week we take a look at a nature deck that doesn't rely on elves. Instead, it uses zombies from the corruption aspect, along with some early game removal on Spellweaver Deck Tech.
Toss the bucket.
So this deck idea was brought to my attention by Senillian, and in all fairness, I have two different versions of this deck, slightly modified from Senillian's latest update. There's not much of a difference. Namely, here is my version. It uses 2 Call of Jaleas and 3 Jungle Death Traps. You'll notice in Senillian's version, he uses 3 Ambush Strikes and 2 Jungle Death Traps. That's really the only difference, and this deck tends to be a little bit more aggressive. This tends to be a little bit more controlling. So why do I run Call of Jalea? Call of Jalea allows me to pull out my Jungle Death Trap, my Fae of Charm, or Venerated Unicorn whenever I need them, assuming, of course, I have Call of Jalea in my hands. With Senillian's version, using the Ambush Strike, it is an instant spell, and it's very powerful, and it tends to make this deck a little bit more aggressive. So depending on your playstyle and how you want to use this deck, you can either go for a little bit more of a mid-game control style or a little bit more aggressive with the Ambush Strike. Now there is one other note that I need to mention, and that is the Shrines. I run 20 Shrines, Senillian runs 21. I've started to see a lot more decks since Open Beta use 21 Shrines instead of 20. And I think that's due to the fact that if you're just not drawing into the right shrines, and based on the number of cards, let's take a look at the number here. We've got 28 creatures, so in creature-heavy decks, you may need an extra shrine, and for some reason that 21 number seems to work a little bit better in not being shrine dry, per se, because otherwise you've got 28 creatures, you've got a much higher likelihood of drawing into the creatures, which of course you can't play if you don't have the shrines. So I think that's why there's 21 in this deck. I run with 20 still. It doesn't seem to have too much of a problem. Also, I've got the Advanced Nievo, which with Reverence, although this is definitely a late game hero aspect, I can draw a lot of cards. So assuming I have a lot of creatures, which I do, essentially what Reverence does is it allows you to reduce the cost of all your cards down to a minimum of 1, but down by 2. Excuse me. It reduces them to 1 less, down to a minimum of 1. Most of them will cost 1. In the case of the Haldari Rider, of course, she's going to cost 2. But the Jungle Death Traps are going to cost 1, Fae of Charm is 1, Venerated Unicorn is 1, Plague Vermin is 1, Infected Survivor is 1, Rotting Remains is 1, Flesh Sculptor is 1, and Mesmerizing Spirit is 1. So all of your cards are super cheap, and assuming you continue to draw into creatures, because whenever you play a creature you draw into a card, it's not impossible for the Reverence skill to give you 5+ creatures per turn to be able to cycle 5 cards and play 5 creatures on the same turn. It's really an amazing trick. It's awesome. It doesn't happen all the time, but it is definitely a key integral part of this deck. So, now that I've explained all that, you'll notice that there's a lot of cheap creatures in here because it's got a lot of early game. It needs early game to survive. Plague Vermins are something that you're going to want to mulligan for right away. You've got 4 of these in the deck, and of course you can sacrifice them instead of running them in to do an attack or a block. So it's really a very versatile card, high quality card. Next, I'm going to stick with the Corruption for a minute because this is all your early game. You want Infected Survivor. Now, Infected Survivor, of course, when he dies, and it's a 3-speed, so it's a nice blocker, will give you those Zombie Legionnaires. Now, keep in mind that there are 4 Flesh Sculptors in this deck, and this is where all your zombies come from. If you've got an Infected Survivor and you kill it with a Flesh Sculptor on board, you're getting 2 zombies out of that. Now, of course, zombies are slow, right? So why would you want a 2/2 Zombie Legionnaire? Because they're only a 1-speed, and what can they do for you? Well, when you flood the board with a bunch of slow zombies, there's no possible way for your opponent to defend against all those zombies. So basically, it's a swarm, it's a Zerg tactic. So that's part of a win condition there, is just filling up the board with a bunch of zombies. Now, there is one early game card that you may want from nature, and that is Jungle Death Trap. Jungle Death Trap, if left unchecked and the trap is not sprung, is a 4/4. Now, it's very slow, but if there is no answer for this, that's 4 damage a turn. Essentially, 5 turns, Jungle Death Trap will kill. 1 Jungle Death Trap will kill your opponent. It never happens that way, but that's a nice way of thinking about it. One thing to keep in mind with Jungle Death Trap, do not play more than 1 Jungle Death Trap at a time, because they will all spring off of 1 character being played, so you'll essentially waste those 2nd or 3rd Jungle Death Traps. Play 1 at a time. So this is something that you might want to have in your hand early. In addition, it's not a creature. Call of Jalea is something that's okay in your hand as well, because it allows you to pull up a Jungle Death Trap, a Unicorn to get rid of those artifacts and spells, or a Fae of Charm. A Fae of Charm is a late game card. As a matter of fact, it's only one of 2 cards or actually it is the only card, your hero skill is the only other skill that requires 3 levels. Fey of Charm requires 3 levels, 1 in nature. Your skill requires 3 levels, 2 in nature. So at the end, you're looking at 2 nature and 1 corruption shrine, or 1 corruption level for this deck. You'll notice everything here only costs 1 or 2 levels, and none of them are more than 1 corruption level. So the corruption side is quite cheap, and that's what corruption does well. It has some good, strong early game. We just pulled out all the corruption late game cards, things like Dread Knight, for in favor of things like Haldari Rider, which has Swift, and it is a 3-speed 3/3. Now, with the Senilian version, of course, that Haldari Rider can also be buffed with an Ambushing Strike. Now, I'm going to talk about Ambushing Strike in Senilian's version a little bit because it is just as good as my version. It's just a different playstyle, honestly. And when you look at these deck techs, keep in mind that there are certain cards that are techie that can be swapped out. Things like Ambush Strike versus Call of Jalea. It is based on your playstyle and how you're comfortable with playing. So if you'd like to use the Ambushing Strike, keep in mind that it is an instant spell. It is also used very well and very effectively because it's giving you 2 attack and 2 health. So in a blocking situation, or when your opponent is attacking one of your creatures, you can throw an Ambushing Strike on that creature and essentially kill your opponent's creature that was attacking and save your own. It can also work as a buff for an attack on a Haldari Rider, or really any creature that you need to send into the face for that final extra kill if you need that. And it's just really a preference. Without the Ambushing Strike, with using the Call of Jalea instead, I don't notice that I have any more problems getting any wins with this deck. It's a very versatile deck. It also has some bounce mechanics as well. Let's talk about things like Tornado Outbreak. So this returns a creature to its owner's hand. This doesn't have to be played on your opponent. It can be played on your own card. For example, Venerated Unicorn. We all love that Unicorn because it's a 2/2 3-speed. It's a good solid body on the board, plus it destroys an artifact or a spell. There's tons of artifacts and spells floating around that you will want to get rid of, both on your opponent's side and on your side. Let's say someone plays Maddening Thoughts on you. You definitely want to get rid of that. So you can use the Tornado Outbreak to actually bounce your Unicorn back. There's a few other, let's see, what else? We've got Mesmerizing Spirit. We haven't talked about this card, and if you're not familiar with this card, it's just a good, solid... Now, this could potentially be a tech card, something you might want to switch out of your deck for something else. For example, you could take out your 3 Mesmerizing Spirits and run instead... You could run, let's go ahead and take a look at the corruption creature called Undead Necromancer. So we're running a lot of zombies, right? Now I have tested this out, but I replaced other cards that I probably shouldn't have. Undead Necromancer works okay if you're getting a lot of zombies in your gameplay. If you notice that you always seem to be able to generate a lot of zombies, throw an Undead Necromancer in there. Maybe take out the Mesmerizing Spirit. One card that I found doesn't work. Now, so keep in mind with this deck, you only want to play 1 corruption level. So things like Succubus, although it's an amazing card, don't necessarily fit into this deck because it slows it down considerably, because you need 2 corruption and 2 natures. So while this is an amazing card, I haven't found a way to fit in a Succubus because the cost is just too high. Bloodwitch Harpy is something to consider. However, you have a lot of level 1 cards that you can play. So Bloodwitch Harpy may actually take away from your ability to flood the board with zombies, for example. Now, if you've got a lot of zombies, of course, Bloodwitch Harpy is just giving you extra mana. So that's a card you could consider. Insatiable Ghoul is something you might want to consider as well. That's a decent card. But basically, there's some tech cards in here that you can look at replacing. Mesmerizing Spirit, of course. This is a hand milling card. It takes 1 card out of the player's hand and puts a 2/1 on the backfield, and it's flying, so it's hard to target, of course. It's also used as a nice blocker as well. So that's a card that you could potentially switch out, and I think we've covered just about everything else. Landslide, of course, is here for you don't have a lot of ways to deal with big cards. Of course, you can use Tornado Outbreak, but that just bounces it back to their hand. So they're going to put that card out again. You really want to use Tornado Outbreak on a card that's been buffed, because then the buff is lost. Landslide is another card that works similar to Tornado Outbreak, except it puts them in their owner's deck, on the top of the owner's deck in any order. So you can kind of reverse the order and maybe stall for a turn or two when they get to play that card again. And it also removes up to 2 creatures, artifacts, or spells. So this card can actually remove just about anything in the game, up to 2 of them. So it's actually quite nice, but you don't really need to run more than 2 at any given time. Fey of Charm, of course, is here because you can use your opponent's creatures against them, essentially. So if they've got that really big creature that you just can't seem to remove because you don't have a Tornado Outbreak or you don't have a Landslide, but you have a Fae of Charm on board, you may wind up taking damage from that creature, but that creature is also going to be doing damage to your opponent with Fae of Charm. So in a race situation, Fae really helps tip the win in your scale. So other than that, there are a bunch of shrines here, and then there's 2 skill shrines. Enchanted Spring. Now, Enchanted Spring is not something I rely on heavily in this deck. Your playstyle may suit you a little bit differently, and you may actually want to look at Enchanted Spring earlier in the game and rely on it much more. But this essentially is a bounce mechanism. This is only a bounce mechanism for your hand, I'm sorry, your board. It doesn't work for your opponents like Tornado Outbreak is. So you might want to save these for your opponent if you've got Enchanted Spring up, because it's fairly cheap. It does have a high cooldown of 3 turns, but it allows you to bounce your Unicorn, of course. So that's the Nature Corruption aspect deck. Let's go ahead. I'll show you the numbers real quick. We run 1, of course, Nieva the Revered, 3 Jungle Death Traps, 3 Unicorns, 3 Haldari Riders, 2 Fae of Charm, 4 Plague Vermin, 4 Infected Survivors, 4 Flesh Sculptors. Now, anything that is 4 in here is something that you want to draw into first, and that's why there's 4 of these cards, because the number is higher, and you really want to draw into your Plague Vermins and Infected Survivors first. The only reason there's 4 Flesh Sculptors is because that's kind of key to the deck as far as, your turn 1 is a Plague Vermin turn, or Infected Survivor, and then after that you want to follow up with the Flesh Sculptor. 3 Rotting Remains, a good solid card. 3 Mesmerizing Spirits. 2 Call of Jalea. Now, of course, in Senilian's version, there's actually 3 Ambush Strikes in here instead. 3 Tornado Outbreaks. 2 Landslides. 4 Noxious Fumes. I didn't talk about Noxious Fumes, but if you don't know what Noxious Fumes is and you haven't played Corruption before, learn that card because it's probably one of the best early cheap removal cards in the game. It removes 2 attack and 2 health, and this also works around shielded things like Force Mage, okay? So keep that in mind. It's an amazing card. In my version, I run 20 shrines, 8 nature, 2 enchanted spring, and 10 corruption shrines. Senilian's latest version runs a little bit differently, 8 nature, 2 enchanted, and 11 corruption shrines. Now, the amount of shrines really doesn't, the amount of cards is pretty much equal as far as creatures go, as far as nature, and as far as corruption. You do need 2 nature levels, so you might want to play around with the numbers if you're having problems. But these are just minor tweaks to this amazing deck. So thanks for watching this week's Spellweaver Deck Tech. If you've got any ideas for any decks that you want to see on a future Deck Tech, please don't hesitate to tell me all about it in a message below in a comment, and I'll get back to you. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you on the boards.